Florida, early March morning, pale sunlight filtering through a weathered wooden window frame. In a small house in St. Petersburg, a 78-year-old man sits quietly on an old chair, his trembling hands resting on a worn-out Steelers cap. The once vibrant black and gold colors from the gridiron are now faded, like memories slipping away. He is Glen Edwards, a name that once shook Pittsburgh, the soul of the legendary Steel Curtain defense. With 2 Super Bowl titles, 2 Pro Bowl selections, and 1 All-Pro honor, Edwards was a symbol of courage and grit. In 1975, during Super Bowl IX, it was his hit that forced a fumble paving the way for the Steelers' first-ever championship victory. A year later, in Super Bowl X, with seconds left on the clock, he launched himself into the air, intercepting a pass from Roger Staubach, a play that etched his name into NFL history. As the final whistle blew, the stands erupted, Pittsburgh exploded in snow and cheers. The press called him the last line of defense, the final barrier between victory and defeat. Edwards didn't just represent a team, he embodied a working-class city where sweat, blood, and steel fused into American pride. But the spotlight never shines forever. When the season ended, when the crowd's roar faded into the air, darkness began to consume his life. The collisions and falls that once thrilled fans now left searing back pain with every rain. The 2 Super Bowl rings, symbols of a glorious career, were pawned for just $20 in a desperate battle with addiction. A 21-year marriage dissolved in silence. A name once celebrated on television is now forgotten. Friends dwindled. Those who once toasted victories no longer called. From Pittsburgh's hero, he became a nobody under Florida's harsh sun. Yet through it all, Glen Edwards lives on quietly, resiliently, as if each breath is a new battle. He works in construction, hauling bricks, building walls, fighting both physical pain and the addiction that once nearly took his life. No more stands, no more cheers, but in his clouded eyes, the old fire still flickers. The fire of a man who once stood tall amid snowstorms and the clash of metal. Glen Edwards, the man who brought victory to America, only to be repaid with silence. If you ever wore black and gold, ever cheered when the Steelers hoisted the Lombardi Trophy, remember this is the man you once rooted for, the one America forgot. Born in 1947 in St. Petersburg, Florida, Glen Edwards grew up in a world that was never fair. It was the era of Jim Crow, its roots still deep in every southern street corner, where skin color determined a person's place. His father toiled in steel mills and construction sites, coming home each night with bloodied hands and the unshakable smell of sweat. His mother, a frail woman, cleaned houses for white families, scraping together pennies for food and electricity. They lived in a rickety wooden house on the city's edge, amid the hum of cicadas and the stifling heat of Florida afternoons. Glen learned early that weakness meant being crushed. Gibbs High School wasn't a place for dreams, but a battleground where working-class kids clung to fragile hopes. After school, Glen watched white kids from other neighborhoods board sports buses, wearing new shoes and jerseys with their names stitched on. He, with tattered sneakers and a sweat-soaked shirt, ran alone on a dirt field. He wanted to be seen, just once. But in that world, a black kid was invisible, unless he could fight. Football came to Glen not as a game, but as a fight for survival. When the first ball touched his hands, he knew it was the one thing no one could take from him. At practice, slurs rang out, "Boy, black kid, don't get hurt." Every fall, every bruise, every hit was a lesson. Pain was the only language they couldn't steal. Pain was the only language they couldn't take from me, he later said, his voice rough as if ground by sand. He had no caring coach, no one to wipe his sweat or offer encouragement. He learned to stand up alone, stitch his own wounds, and believe that tears only weakened the one thing he had, his will. In the scorching summer, Glen trained alone on dry grass, throwing the ball into the air and chasing it, imagining a crowd chanting his name. No one knew the silent storm inside that teenager, a burning desire to be recognized, to exist. His father rarely spoke, only saying, "Never let anyone see you're scared." That was the one lesson Glen carried for life. In high school, he played on the local team, often cheated by refs, shoved down by opponents, even jeered by spectators for his skin color. But Glen didn't respond with words. He answered with hits, with every fall and rise, stronger each time. Once after a brutal tackle, his teeth broke, his lips split, but he still smiled, a bloody grin of someone who knew he'd made the crowd remember his name. He didn't need praise, he needed to prove, "I'm here and I won't disappear." In the dim light of Gibbs High's locker room, the air thick with sweat and antiseptic, the 17-year-old stared at his reflection in a cracked mirror, blood still seeping from his lip, his jersey caked in mud. He smiled faintly. For the first time, his name, Glen Edwards, echoed over the school's loudspeaker. Whether in jeers or cheers, it was real, and he knew it was the beginning. From a place where no one believed, he stepped onto a path only those who could endure pain could survive. In that damp, dark locker room, a warrior was born, not by luck, but by wounds, sweat and absolute solitude. In 1971, Glen Edwards entered the NFL without fanfare. Undrafted, with no lucrative contract or grand welcome, he was just another face, a spare part among hundreds of young men dreaming of playing for big teams. But from the depths of obscurity, he began the fight of his life. The Pittsburgh Steelers were building a fearsome defensive unit, where every position was held by a true warrior. They called that defense the Steel Curtain, an impenetrable wall of steel. And Glen, the unknown kid from Florida, decided he'd become a link in that chain, even if it cost him his blood. On the first day of practice, coaches eyed him skeptically, teammates shook their heads. "This guy's too small to play safety." But Glen didn't speak. He just lowered his head and charged into collisions. In every session he crashed into opponents stronger, bigger, faster, like a beast cornered against a wall. His helmet cracked, his shoulders swelled, his knees bled. But after every fall he stood up, his gaze unwavering. "Free safety with no fear," reporters wrote. "He plays like there's no tomorrow." Each tackle was an explosion. The sound of steel meeting flesh echoed across Three Rivers Stadium's grass, reverberating in the hearts of fans. The stands shook, Steelers fans screamed his name, but Glen remained silent, his eyes cold as forged steel. In that world, there was no room for weakness. Pain became the only language he and his kind understood. Super Bowl IX, winter 1975. The game pitted the Steelers against the Minnesota Vikings. The air was biting, snow fell on the field, and Glen Edwards, with eyes sharp as knives, was the only one unfazed by the cold. In the second half, the Vikings neared the end zone, just yards away. The ball was thrown, Glen shot forward like a bullet, his hit on John Gilliam knocking the ball loose, crushing the opponent's hopes. It wasn't just a game-saving tackle, it was the moment that defined the Steel Curtain, a defense forged in sweat and blood. The Steelers won 16-6, claiming their first-ever Lombardi trophy. Pittsburgh erupted, working-class fans embraced in the streets, crying and shouting, "We are champions." Glen Edwards, the undrafted kid, was now a hero, but for him, victory was never enough. A year later, Super Bowl X, the matchup against the Dallas Cowboys, bitter rivals. With 40 seconds left, the Cowboys had one last chance for a game-changing pass. Roger Staubach launched a long throw toward the end zone. Glen Edwards, like a shadow, leaped into the air, his hand snatching the ball. Interception. The whistle blew. Pittsburgh won. The city roared like an earthquake. Fans flooded the field, embracing in snow and flares. That interception made him immortal. The press dubbed him the Wall of Steel, the man who sealed victory for an entire city. But behind the glory, behind the smile for the Lombardi trophy photos, was a bone-deep pain no one saw. That night, as the team sipped champagne, Glen lay in a dark room, teeth clenched against nerve pain shooting down his spine. His head buzzed like a drum, ears rang, and his wrist was so swollen he couldn't remove his glove. His body was a map of scars, each bone and joint a testament to sacrifice. Amid the cheers, he heard nothing but the pounding in his head. The cheers were thunderous, he once said, but the silence afterward was unbearable. Pittsburgh celebrated, but Glen stayed silent, feeling his soul left behind on the frozen field. In the years that followed, He remained a symbol of the steel curtain, but his body began to betray him. His spine wore down from collisions, headaches hammered him every morning, his memory flickered, and loud noises made him nauseous. On the outside, he was a hero, carrying the Steelers' glory, but inside, he was a man slowly suffocated by the very thing that made him. And in the radiant glow of 2 Lombardi trophies, darkness began to creep in, silently waiting to swallow the warrior whole. In 1978, the Pittsburgh Steelers abruptly announced Glen Edwards' trade to the San Diego Chargers. No farewell ceremony, no televised thank you, not even a final glance from those who once called him hero. In minutes, the heart of the legendary defense became a bargaining chip. He vividly recalled the icy sting in his chest as he signed the transfer papers, not because the team betrayed him, but because he realized a bitter truth: in the NFL, the fans' love has an expiration date, and loyalty is just a concept to sell tickets. In San Diego, everything was different. New team, new teammates, but his body was no longer the same. Neck, shoulder, and back injuries flared up with every practice. His knees swelled like balloons after each hit. To play, Glen began relying on painkillers. The first pills dulled the pain, but the pain grew, and the drugs weren't strong enough. In 1979, for the first time, Glen tried cocaine. The white powder made his body feel weightless, the pain vanished, and his mind soared above memories of blood and collisions. It was the only thing that let him forget he was past his prime. But everything has a cost. Money ran dry fast, short-term contracts weren't enough to live on. Friends started avoiding him, the new team lacked connection. When the season ended, Glen wasn't renewed. In just a few years he went from a Super Bowl champion to an unemployed drifter with a broken body and a heavy addiction. In Florida, people occasionally recognized him. "Is that Glen Edwards?" But they spoke in whispers, as if mentioning a ghost. He tried to hide it all, but the truth was undeniable. The Super Bowl IX and X rings, the greatest symbols of his life, were gone. One was pawned for $20 to buy drugs. The other was lost in a drunken haze, waking up in a room with nothing but empty bottles and shattered glass. Years later, his voice cracked like cutting wind. "I used to wear my victories, now I wear my shame." His 21-year marriage crumbled silently. His wife left, taking their child, unable to endure the nights he lost control, throwing things, screaming in the dark. His driver's license was revoked after a minor crash while intoxicated. The police didn't need to check his name. One look at his face was enough. "You used to be with the Steelers, right?" Glen just bowed his head, silent. No fame, no family, no rings, no one. Old friends, old teammates, those who once lifted the trophy with him were gone. They had their own lives, jobs, honor, while Glen had nothing but a body that betrayed him. At night he wandered St. Petersburg's dark streets, drawn to corners where lost souls gathered. Cocaine became the only religion he still believed in. Florida's darkness swallowed him, slowly, cruelly, as if reclaiming the glory he once held. Some nights, he woke in a moldy motel room, yellow light spilling onto his empty hands, where 2 rings once shone. His bare fingers, marked by old calluses, now only trembled. He stared at them for a long time, remembering the cold metal against his skin, the feeling of being revered by all of America, then let out a hoarse, dry laugh like snapping iron. "I used to be a winner," he whispered to himself. "Now I'm just a memory." His career ended without a send-off. No articles, no tributes, only silence, the silence of the stands that once roared when he intercepted Staubach's pass, now echoing only in the mind of a lost addict. In the mirror, he saw not a champion's face but the shadow of a man he no longer recognized. Deep wrinkles, sunken eyes, a lost smile, reduced to 2 words: "used to." In that moment, Glen Edwards understood all cheers eventually fade, all glory comes at a cost. The NFL took his youth, health, honor, and finally his soul. All that remained was a man sitting in the dark, staring at his empty hands, listening to his heart's weakening beat, like a clock counting down. When the crowd stops cheering, the real cruelty begins. From the 1980s to the 1990s, Glen Edwards lived like a ghost drifting through life. No home, no family, no job. He slept in an old car parked in an empty lot behind a church in St. Petersburg, Florida. At night, the hum of insects and distant trucks blended with the wheezing breath of a man once celebrated by all of America. Each morning, he woke to the acrid smell of liquor, his trembling hands searching for an old photo tucked in his jacket, a snapshot from 1976, showing him hoisting the Lombardi trophy amid a roaring crowd. In that photo he beamed, eyes bright, shoulders brimming with strength. In reality, his face was gaunt, his beard long, his gaze lost. Some nights, Glen stared at that photo for hours, then wept, tears rolling down hands that once shattered opponents' offensive lines, now frail like an old man's. He thought of death, times when addiction made his heart race so wildly he thought he wouldn't survive. But each time he closed his eyes, he saw his younger self, the cheers, the stands, Pittsburgh's workers shouting his name, and he couldn't die. One rainy night, police stopped Glen while he drove drunk. A flashlight shone in his face, and the officer hesitated, asking, "Are you Glen Edwards, Steelers?" Glen didn't speak, only nodded, eyes fixed on his cuffed hands. In the flashing red lights of the patrol car, the scene was like a funeral for his past, the hero of yesteryear now escorted like a wayward soul. But that moment of shame became a turning point. In the jail cell that night, he stared into a small wall mirror, seeing his aged, hollow, empty face, and whispered, "If I could hit others that hard, I can hit back at my own demons." From that day, Glen began to quit. No doctors, no rehab centers, just willpower. He splashed cold water on his face each morning, a ritual to stay alert. He endured trembling, sweating, convulsing, but survived each night. After months, his body was frail, but his eyes were different, clear, alive. When strong enough, he took a job as a laborer at a small Florida construction company. Each morning, he hauled bricks, mixed cement, his back aching but never complaining. "This job doesn't need fame," he said. "It just needs real hands." Among fellow workers, he found himself again, a man who needed no stage, only an honest day's work. Though poor, Glen found meaning in simplicity. He began talking to neighborhood kids, many caught in drugs, fights, or despair. He shared his story, from Super Bowl glory to the old car in the lot. "Fame doesn't save anyone," he said, voice rough as gravel. "It only drags you down if you think it's everything." The kids listened, not out of fear, but because they saw raw truth, a man who'd been at the top, yet survived losing it all. Glen became a quiet role model for those beaten down by life. Occasionally, he was invited to small Steelers alumni events, but few recognized him. He didn't blame anyone. To an interviewer, he said, "The crowd was gone, but my fight wasn't." He knew no one cheered for him anymore, but he still fought, not to beat others, but to defeat the demons that stole his honor. On the job site, each hammer strike was a blow to his past. Each brick laid was a piece of his life rebuilt. Glen had no Super Bowl, no stage, but he had something the NFL never gave him: peace. In his weathered eyes, there was no longer the glow of glory, but the steady flame of a man who'd died and come back to life. And there, amid cement dust, sweat and Florida's sun, people saw Glen Edwards, the fallen warrior, had returned, not to win, but to prove that even in defeat, dignity could still stand tall. In the 2000s, Glen Edwards lived in a small house on the outskirts of St. Petersburg, Florida, where the morning sun streamed through the window, but wasn't warm enough to chase the chill from his bones. Now in his 70s, his back hunched, his steps slow, each one leaning on an old wooden cane. His life was quiet, like the fading breath of an autumn sea. Day after day, Glen woke at 6 a.m., brewed weak coffee, and sat on the porch watching people head to work. Sometimes he sat there for hours, hands gently rubbing the faded Steelers cap. To others, it was just an old item. To Glen, it was the last witness to a time when America revered him. His body was a map of wounds. When it rained, his head throbbed as if pounded by 100 hammers, his ears rang, his eyes blurred, his joints stiff as rusted steel. His right shoulder, once his greatest weapon, now ached so much he couldn't lift a glass of water. To a rare old friend, he once said, "They cheered my hits. They forgot my hurt." He spoke not with resentment, but as if stating a cold fact. His marriage never mended. His wife lived with their child in another state, rarely calling. Old friends, many who'd lifted the Lombardi trophy with him, had passed away from heart disease, injuries, or depression. Each time he heard of a death, Glen froze, staring at an old photo on the wall, where a dozen young faces grinned in black and gold jerseys. Now most were gone from the field forever. In the afternoons, Glen turned on a small TV, playing an old DVD of Super Bowl X. The screen flickered, but he recognized every moment. The announcer's voice, the crowd's roar. He saw himself, young, fast, eyes sharp, leaping to intercept that fateful pass. He sat unblinking. When the final whistle sounded, he saw a tear roll down his wrinkled cheek. The cheers from the tape echoed in the empty room, joined only by the hum of a fan and the ticking of a clock. Some nights, he dreamed of the old stands, bright lights, fans chanting "Steelers, Steelers." He saw himself running, strong teammates embracing him. But when he turned to find them, they vanished. He woke in the night, cold sweat soaking his shirt, looking around, only darkness and the old chair. In that moment, he knew he was still alive, but the glory in him had long died. Recurring nerve pain kept him awake for days. Painkillers no longer worked. He learned to endure in silence, sitting in the dark, breathing slowly, waiting for the pain to pass. His body was like a rusted old car, but his eyes held a faint spark, unyielding pride. He kept in touch with a few old Steelers teammates, through charity meetups. They sat together, hands trembling over coffee, swapping stories. Someone asked, "Glen, if you could go back to 1976, would you do it again?" He looked into the distance, gave a faint smile. "I'd do it all, but this time I'd keep the ring." His life was simple, reading sports pages, watering plants, answering rare letters from old fans. One young fan wrote, "You're why I love the Steelers." Glen read it repeatedly, placing it beside his Super Bowl photo, a way to hold on to the belief that he was still remembered. He knew he wasn't rich, famous, or invited to lavish ceremonies, but in his heart, he held a pride no one could take. The pride of a man who'd stood in the fiercest arenas, bled for a city, a jersey. Though America forgot, he never forgot himself. And as the sun set each day, Glen sat on his porch, watching the orange blaze on the horizon, his clouded eyes reflecting its faint light. He knew his body was fading, but his soul still lived, holding fast to the vow of his youth, never fall. In that silence, amid the steady hum of the fan, he still heard the distant echo of the past, the crowd, the whistle, the clash of steel. And he smiled, whispering softly, "The crowd is gone, but the game is still in me." Outside, night fell over St. Petersburg, and the old hero sat there, quietly, amid unending pain and blazing memories, like a dying flame, stubbornly burning bright in the wind. One late autumn afternoon, in a small Pittsburgh community hall, Glen Edwards reappeared before the public after years of silence. It was a Steelers alumni gathering, where the faces of yesteryear were now aged, hair gray, hands trembling, steps limping. He walked slowly, leaning on his cane, but his eyes shone as they once did. When his name was called, the room stood and clapped, not the thunderous roar of the stands, but the applause of those who'd bled on the same grass. Glen stepped to the podium, trembling hands gripping the microphone, his voice hoarse, low, full of pain and wisdom. "They get you, they trade you, they get rid of you, but no one tells you how to live after that." The room fell silent. Young players in their 20s looked at him differently, not with pity, but with respect and fear. They realized his words weren't just about football, but about their own futures. Glen didn't offer polished lessons, no charitable platitudes, no empty rallying cries. He just told the truth about drugs, loss, being forgotten. "America loves its heroes on Sunday. It forgets them on Monday," he said, voice catching. The room was still. No one argued, because they all knew it was the NFL's rawest truth, where the lights shine brighter than any stage, but turn colder than anywhere when they dim. After the talk, young players approached, saying they'd never forget the lesson. One shook his hand, whispering, Thank you for saying what no one dares. Glen just smiled, his eyes kind and weary. He wasn't a teacher or a speaker. He was just a man who'd walked through light and darkness. Weeks later, at a small Florida community event, a 10-year-old boy approached Glen, holding a Steelers cap, shyly asking, "Sir, can you sign this? My dad says you saved the Steelers in Super Bowl X." Glen gave a soft laugh, his old hands trembling as he signed the cap, ink slanting. He leaned down, saying slowly, warmly, "Don't just remember the wins, remember the men." The boy nodded, not fully grasping the meaning, but Glen's smile made the moment sacred. Back at his small house, Glen watched the latest Steelers game on TV. When they won, he smiled, not out of pride, but relief. He knew the young players were carrying on the path he'd paved, and though they didn't know him, in every collision, every tackle, the soul of men like him lived on, the generation that traded blood for the foundation of an empire. In a rare interview, a reporter asked, "Do you have regrets? Would you choose this path again?" Glen looked at his calloused, deformed hands, then answered softly, "No, I don't regret it. Football gave me purpose, but it took nearly everything. I just wish America remembered we're human, not machines." His answer wasn't just for football, but for a nation that builds heroes into myths, then forgets them when they can no longer give. Glen lacked the strength to change the NFL, or millions to fund help for former players, but he had something greater: truth. Every word was a piece of his real life, a warning to the next generation. In his 70s, he was occasionally invited to small events, sitting in the back, smiling gently when his name was mentioned. He didn't need the spotlight, only to know someone still remembered. To him that was the greatest reward. Once leaving a talk, a young reporter chased after him, asking, "What's your legacy?" Glen paused, gazing at the sunset, his voice low and rough like wind over metal. "I didn't leave money, I didn't leave trophies, I just left the truth. That fame saves no one, that glory is fleeting, but resilience is the true legacy," was his final lesson to America. As the sun sank below Florida's horizon, Glen Edwards sat alone on his porch, watching the red light glow on his old Steelers cap. In that silence, he was no longer a hero or a failure. He was just a man who fought, fell, and learned to rise, and perhaps that was the greatest victory life gave him. In 2025, Glen Edwards is 78 years old. He walks slowly, hands trembling, eyes dimming, but each morning he still puts on the old worn Steelers cap before stepping onto the porch. The cap is faded, its edges frayed, but to him it shines brighter than any diamond. His small Florida house is hauntingly quiet. On the wall, among family photos, hangs a large picture, capturing a moment from Super Bowl X. Glen leaping through the air, eyes focused, hands outstretched to block Roger Staubach's pass. There are no rings in the cabinet, no trophies, no tangible proof of glory, only a simple wooden frame and faint light streaming through the window. When asked if he regretted losing both Super Bowl rings, Glen only smiled and said softly, "He doesn't need the ring anymore. The ring was never the glory, the man was." Now Glen's days pass in silence. He wakes early, makes his own coffee, and shuffles outside to breathe the damp sea air. His back aches, his hands shake, his heart beats slowly, but he keeps his ritual, lifting his head to watch the sunrise. A young neighbor sometimes stops his car, waving, "Morning, sir." Glen nods, smiles kindly, and no one knows the old man was once the one who brought the Steelers their first ever victory. In the small living room, an old TV still works, with Super Bowl IX and X DVDs tucked in a drawer. Some afternoons, he plays the 1975 game, the grainy audio still vivid enough to revive memories. When the stands erupt with Steelers, his eyes light up. He sees himself young, strong, reliving moments of blood, sweat, and pride. And when the final whistle sounds, he gives a faint smile, proud yet pained. A single tear rolls onto the wooden floor, maybe for his teammates, maybe for the man he once was. Outside, Florida's sunset spills across the sky, red like molten steel. Glen sits quietly, watching the sun sink, his shadow stretching long on the ground. He's no longer wealthy, famous, or mentioned in sports news, But he has something greater, peace, earned by paying every debt to life. His body is a testament to an era where people lived, fought, suffered, and were forgotten, yet held on to dignity until the end. And then a voice narrates, slow like a farewell, he gave everything, his body, his marriage, his sanity, so we could cheer. Remember him, remember them all, for behind every cheer on the field, behind every victory America celebrated, are flesh and blood people who traded their health, youth, and sometimes their souls for a fleeting moment of glory the audience saw on screen. Glen Edwards is one of them, a silent hero, forgotten, but never ceasing to fight. As night falls, he turns off the TV, leans back in his chair. On the table lies the tattered Steelers cap, the only relic of his golden era. He touches it with trembling hands, whispering, "We were champions once." Outside, crickets chirp like the ticking of time, and perhaps, somewhere in the darkness, the souls of his old teammates are still cheering, waiting for him to join the lineup again, not on the field, but in a place without pain. But tonight, Glen is still here, still alive, still remembering, still the last warrior of the steel curtain. If this story touches your heart, share it, because legends like Glen Edwards don't die when they pass, they only die when we stop remembering them. Looking at Glen Edwards' life, one must ask, what does America truly honor, the victory, or the person behind it? This isn't just a story about a former football player, it's a story about the cost of the American dream, paid in real bone, real blood, real life. Glen was once the last line of defense, stopping Roger Staubach's final pass in Super Bowl X to secure Pittsburgh's victory, and before that, forcing a fumble from the Minnesota Vikings in Super Bowl IX. Those moments didn't just bring the Lombardi Trophy to the Steelers, they created collective memories for a working-class city, giving Pittsburgh faith that they could rise above factory sweat to stand atop America. But what about the cost? What happens after we stop clapping? The same man after 1978 was traded away like a commodity. The same man leaned on cocaine to numb the pain, until he pawned both Super Bowl rings for $20. The same man slept in a car, was handcuffed like a delinquent, looked at with pity instead of respect. The same man at 78 lives alone in a small Florida house, hands trembling, eyes dim, with only an old Steelers cap and a Super Bowl X photo on the wall. No rings, no trophies, no money. And note this, he isn't bitter, he chose to rise. He quit drugs. He worked construction to live as an honest man. He spoke to young players saying plainly, they get you, they trade you, they get rid of you, but no one tells you how to live after that. And then he said the most painful, truest thing, America loves its heroes on Sunday. It forgets them on Monday. The lesson isn't just for the NFL, it's a mirror for all of us. We as American society are great at praising someone in the moment they bring us pride, a win, a song, a flag raised high, but afterward, when they're in pain, addicted, alone, we turn away. Glen reminds us that glory isn't in the ring was never the glory, the man was. The value isn't in the symbol, but in the person who sacrificed to make it exist. In truth, this lesson cuts to the core of every American's life. Don't just love someone when they're useful to you. Love them when they fall. Don't just remember achievements. Remember the people, because if we don't learn this, we're not just abandoning Glen Edwards, we're abandoning the very values we proudly call American. If Glen Edwards' story moves you, please subscribe to join us in continuing to tell the stories of silent heroes forgotten by time. Thank you for watching. See you in the next video, where we continue to honor those who sacrificed so America could cheer in the light.